Hi, my name is Anne Russell. I am reading slowly, very slowly, as you can see, through my book called Alcohol and Pregnancy, My Responsible Disturbance. It's the second edition. Sorry, my jaw's sore. So this is chapter 8, and it's called Early Indications That Something Was Wrong.
Okay.
And that's my husband again. This starts off with a poem. I will read it. Anyway, I will read it. So it's called My Precious Children. Unbearable grief. Remember those words? In his infinite wisdom, God wanted me to know how it felt. Not yet content, he assigned my son a disability so he could learn from the pain of addiction, the challenge of appearing outwardly capable, the anguish of not meeting expectations, and the sorrow of full awareness of these things. But in his defense, I have my two beautiful boys. I wrote that in 2007. So this is a fairly short chapter, I think. Since arriving at Greenvale, I had been dreaming about having a baby. Don and I had been married for 2 years and our relationship was strong. We both wanted to have a child to add to our happiness and complete our little family. It didn't take long before I tested positive. Before the happy news was confirmed, but while in the very early stages of pregnancy, I had consumed far too much alcohol at a party held by a family who owned the hotel. I also had an accident on my motocross bike when I was on a ride with 8 other people. The accident occurred at fairly high speed, but was more embarrassing than physically damaging. Nevertheless, I was anxious about the effect these events may have had on my baby. At that time, neither incident was of concern to my obstetrician. And this is just an aside in a text box. Almost 50% of women use alcohol while pregnant in Australia. This means that almost half of all babies born in Australia are prenatally exposed to alcohol. This doesn't mean they have FASD, but it does mean that they are at risk for FASD. It also means that as a nation, we are drinking far too much during our childbearing years. So I can't remember whether I drank much during my pregnancy with Mick, but I know I could have consumed or would have consumed some alcohol, the regular social drink or drinks that had always been an important part of my life. After reading up on FASD and linking the characteristics of the condition to his first few months, I would say that my baby was very much affected. I had no contact with children or babies prior to my son's birth, other than reading about pregnancy and child health in a book when I became pregnant. There was nothing at all in there about alcohol and its dangers. I do recall being enormously confident that the placental barrier filtered all substances that were toxic to the fetus. I thought that was the many reasons for its existence. Even though I was happy to be pregnant, I had grave fears about being a mother. Would I be able to cope? Would I develop a mental illness or a personality disorder like my mother? Would I inadvertently hurt my baby? It was desperately important to me that I was a good mother and that I gave my children unconditional love and caring that adequately supported their psychological well-being. Many years before, I'd made a promise to my future children that I would dedicate my life to them. I would provide a nurturing, loving family environment so they could achieve the peace, contentment and self-esteem that I had never been quite able to achieve. Even after 50 years, I still recall this promise vividly. I know where I was, how old I was, and what happened to me that I felt the need to make such an important promise to children who didn't yet exist. My pregnancy progressed until I was referred for a scan. I could see him at last. Although it was not possible to know what gender he was, I knew he was a boy. I could almost feel his little heart beating like mad. He was a real little person inside me. From that moment on, I was a mother. I knew that my baby would be special, different to all other babies, because he was already loved more than I thought possible, and he was only the size of my fist. I had very few episodes of illness and stayed active and maintained what I thought was a healthy lifestyle. The doctor didn't ask me about nutrition, drug use, or the use of vitamins such as folate, and there was no mention at all of the potentially harmful effects of alcohol. So my pregnancy developed with nothing of note occurring until I had an amniocentesis when I was almost 9 months pregnant. After the procedure, the obstetrician advised me to go to the pub and have a few drinks with my husband. These were his exact words. I remember them because they were a bit of a shock. He said that there are times when an amniocentesis will bring on labour and that alcohol acts as a tocolytic. Of course, a tocolytic is a substance that reduces the chance of someone going into early labour. Of course, I did as I was told. Michael was born by caesarean section at 6 o'clock on a beautiful March morning, almost 2 weeks later. At 7:30 a.m. on the 23rd of March 1981, I woke from the general anaesthetic to see Don sitting next to my bed. In his eyes were tears, and I briefly wondered what had gone wrong. But then he smiled, and 2 fat tears slowly fell down onto the floor. I knew then that everything had gone well, because he was holding the most beautiful little baby I'd ever seen. From the first moment I saw Michael, I knew that nothing in my life could equal that moment. He was a living, breathing example of our love. He was a miracle. I knew he would be destined for great things. Barely 2 minutes later, he was whisked away to be bathed, prodded and poked. When they brought him back to me about an hour later in the recovery room, it was such a joy to finally hold this sweet, precious child. The doctor verified that Mick appeared to be a normal, healthy, if somewhat underweight, infant, and gave us the all clear that he was medically sound. After 6 days in the hospital, we took him back to our home in Greenvale. So this is an aside too in a text box. Looking after an infant who has been prenatally exposed to alcohol can be extraordinarily challenging. The crying and obvious discomfort and distress of a child sends parents into waves of sleep-deprived anxiety. With a diagnosis of FASD, or if the child is thought to be at risk for FASD, appropriate interventions can be implemented. For example, some babies with this condition require a dark, quiet, unstimulating room. They may prefer to be firmly wrapped in a blanket or cheesecloth wrap. They are children who do better in a muted environment in a world where parents and teachers are encouraged to provide stimulation at a very young age. I had been sure I would breastfeed, but because I didn't have any experience, and particularly not with such a fussy eater, it went pear-shaped, literally. Mick would protest and wail so much that I despaired he was getting enough milk. This was confirmed by comments from the nurses at the clinic that he was not thriving at his regular checks. I was frightened for him, and he was testy, tired and teary. After 4 long weeks I gave in, defeated. I was a failure. I couldn't even breastfeed my own baby. So I stopped feeding him and brought formula. I didn't even know that you had to stop feeding gradually, otherwise it can become very painful for mum. He began to thrive on formula, and I would now get just a little more sleep. As I wasn't with him 24/7 by necessity, I had some short periods of time to myself. This inactivity precipitated a sadness. Because he wasn't crying so much, I didn't have to be, he would sleep is what I meant. And when he was sleeping, I couldn't do any, housework and stuff, but it just not having to continually worry about him, it left a time when I started becoming sad and foreboding that sapped my energy and my will. So I was getting postnatal depression. Because of the experiences I had as a young child, I learned earlier than most about the difficulties associated with depression and anxiety. By the time I'd stopped trying to breastfeed, both were coiled around me like a snake around its prey. Depression was as familiar to me as breathing, and anxiety was an unwelcome guest at every interaction. Yet what I faced after mixed birth paled my previous experiences. It was overwhelming and was compounded by Mick's almost continuous crying and my lack of sleep. He'd been crying just about the whole time I was trying to breastfeed, and for many months afterwards he would just cry, and I had no idea and no way of, no idea what was wrong with him. He must have been crying for a reason. I tried everything I could think of to settle him. But after so many sleepless nights and days, I wasn't functioning. Even putting one foot in front of the other required more energy and brain power than I had at my disposal. Well, that's chapter 8. Okay. Thank you very much. I will be reading chapter 9 shortly. Thank you.